Well, in Georgia, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger is set to speak with federal prosecutors today as the investigation into Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election intensifies. In January of 2021, the former president pressured Raffensperger to find more votes to help reverse his loss in the election. So Rob Legare joins us now to talk a little bit more about this. Good to see you, Rob. I think everyone is going to remember, that infamous request. Can you just find, 11,000 more votes? I think that was what was said on the phone call. This is Raffensperger's first interview with the Justice Department. Sort of surprising to me. What's going to be the focus of this?
Right. Good morning, Anna Marie. Thanks for having me. So as you said, in the fallout of the 2020 presidential election, former President Donald Trump called Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and said, can you find 11,780 votes? And so what they're going to talk about today with the special counsel investigators is the fallout of that presidential election. Now, Brad Raffensperger since testified before the House January 6th Select Committee and said there were no votes to find. And in the fallout of the election, his family was actually threatened and he felt in danger. And so we should expect him today to touch on the fallout from that election, what was said on the call, and testify to the fact that he has said, there was no fraud in Georgia or widespread fraud in Georgia in the 2020 presidential election. It's important to note that prosecutors, as you mentioned, have been looking at the events after the presidential election and January 6th for some time now. They have in recent weeks been honing in on certain states and events in certain states. And so now it appears they are talking to Georgia's Secretary of State. Also important to note, this is not a grand jury testimony where he was subpoenaed and has to come here to Washington, D.C. to talk to investigators. Instead, through his spokesperson, has said that this is going to be a voluntary interview with investigators.
All right. So we also know that fundraising and those alternate electors, those are two things that the DOJ is also looking into. Can you remind us of the alternate electors scheme, and what more can you tell us about what the DOJ is looking at?
Sure. So after the 2020 presidential election, prosecutors are now looking into whether and how certain Trump officials and Trump attorneys could have pressured individuals in certain states to come to the Capitol and represent that Joe Biden was not the winner and instead Donald Trump was. And so a few years ago, the Justice Department had said that they were actually looking into this. In recent weeks, we have seen some of those electors, including individuals from Nevada, testify before a grand jury here in Washington, D.C. A former Trump aide who was potentially connected to this scheme also appeared before the grand jury here. And so it appears that investigators are really taking a look at this. Another thing to recognize as well is that investigators have polling data from Trump's campaign and from after the 2020 presidential election, election data, voter data, that they commissioned from two different firms to evaluate the results of the 2020 presidential election. CBS News, we've reported that at least one of those found that there was no widespread fraud in the election, and the report debunked a lot of those claims. And so now they're bringing these reports to witnesses in the grand jury to ask them about that.
Okay, so this is like an octopus, right? There's so many tentacles all over the place. I got another question to ask you about. A spokesperson for former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani has confirmed that investigators with the special counsel's office recently interviewed him as part of the investigation into the January 6th riot. So we moved away from the efforts in Georgia, and now we're back to the January 6th riots. What can you tell us about the interview with Giuliani?
Right. So our colleague here at CBS News, Graham Cates, confirmed last night that Giuliani, in fact, did appear with investigators for a voluntary and professional, as Giuliani's spokesperson put it, interview. Now, Giuliani's folks say that he is not a target of this interview, but instead was there voluntarily and in a professional manner. Now, sources told our Graham Cates that in the interview they discussed meetings at the White House that Giuliani had, as well as interactions he might have had with Trump attorneys as well. And so they're definitely going to be taking a look at that.
All right. Rob Legare, thank you so much.